get started. Some people are still joining, but that's 1 o'clock, so we'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks for joining us today to hear about the results of the impact of reducing meat and dairy in the diets of children and young people, in line with the recommendations from the Climate Change Committee. My name's Sophie Milne, and I'm the events manager at Food Standards Scotland. Today we're joined by Alana MacDonald, Senior Public Health Nutrition Advisor at Food Standards Scotland, who will be providing some background to the report, and by Professor Lindsay Jacks from the University of Edinburgh, who will be taking you through the results. Since we're on Teams Live, you will not be able to unmute your microphones to ask questions, but we do welcome questions and comments that you may have, and these can be posted into the chat, which should appear at the top of your screen. We will have time for questions at the end and hope to be able to answer as many of them as possible. And today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with you all in due course. I will now hand you over to Alana MacDonald. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. And yes, I just want to add my thanks to everyone for coming along to this webinar to hear about this important research. So I plan to just briefly introduce the research in terms of background before I hand over to Professor Lindsay Jacks, who is a Professor of Global Health and Nutrition and Deputy Director of the Division of Global Agriculture and Food Systems at the University of Edinburgh. And Lindsay is also our Principal Investigator for our Dietary Surveys and Analysis contract, including for this work on meat and dairy. In terms of background, this work really began in 2023 when we commissioned the first phase of this research to explore the impact of reducing meat and dairy intakes in Scotland in line with recommendations from the Climate Change Committee. And this first phase of research focused on adults using data from the Scottish Health Survey and looked at the impact on intakes of key micronutrients and achievement of the Scottish dietary goals and on chronic disease risk. I won't go through these findings in detail, but would definitely encourage you all to look at the report on our website in addition to the one we're presenting today. But a key finding was that by reducing our intake of red and red processed meat to a maximum of 70 grams per day, in line with existing dietary advice in Scotland, we could achieve a 16% reduction in total meat intakes, which is a significant contribution to the recommendations made by the Climate Change Committee. The research also highlighted, unsurprisingly, a need for significant dietary improvement overall, which would not only benefit our health, but enable positive progress towards climate change ambitions. So those were the key findings for adults, and following on from the publication of our extensive report on children's diets from our DISH survey earlier this year, we undertook further analysis of this data to understand the specific impacts of reduced meat and dairy on children's diets, achievement of the Scottish dietary goals, and also on greenhouse gas emissions. And that's now what Professor Jacks will present to you. So I'm going to hand over to Lindsay, and I really look forward to your questions and the discussion at the end. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Alana. Hopefully everyone can see my screen with the slides now, but maybe just let me know, Alana, if you can't, or Sophie.
Yep, that looks good. Thanks,
excellent.
Lindsay.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so thanks again for coming along today to see these results, and looking forward to your questions and feedback on our findings today. Before I jump in, I just wanted to start out by acknowledging that this was a huge team effort, mentioning particularly Joe Kennedy, Geraldine McNeil, and Ricky Runyons, who were instrumental in doing the analysis that I'll be presenting today, as well as Mike and Pete at Oxford, who were instrumental in helping us link the food reported in the DISH survey to greenhouse gas emissions. So by way of background, Alana also already mentioned some of this, but just to mention that the 7th Carbon Budget released earlier this year by the UK Climate Change Committee reiterated that recommendation that we had looked at in adults to reduce meat and dairy consumption by 20% over the next 10 years and rising eventually to a 35% decrease in meat by 2050. And whilst those targets include all meat, so they also include poultry, in the 7th Carbon Budget, they did have this additional recommendation for a steeper reduction in red meat, which is consistent with the Scottish dietary goals for red and red processed meat. And the reason for that in the Climate Change Committee report was because of the especially high greenhouse gas emissions associated with ruminant meat production. It's important to point out two particular things with regard to the CCC recommendations. So the first is that they explicitly recommend the replacement of these products with plant-based alternative proteins, as well as whole foods that are plant-based. And also, it's important to point out that these are population level reductions. And so that's just a way of saying that it doesn't mean everyone will reduce by 20%. Some may reduce by much more than that. For example, people who are eating well above the current red and red processed meat guidelines, they may see much bigger decreases. And then there are some that may not reduce at all. So children and adolescents, for example, may see very little change in consumption, but overall, across the whole population, there's this aiming for this 20% reduction. So the aims of this project were twofold. First, to describe current intakes of meat and dairy among children and young people living in Scotland, and second, to model the impact of various meat and dairy reduction and replacement scenarios on energy and nutrient intake, achievement of the Scottish Dietary Goals, and greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll just note that in scenarios where we have replacements, the dairy was replaced with plant-based dairy alternatives, so things like oat milk, and the meat was replaced with a variety of things. So we looked at a range of food substitutes, things from beans and pulses and legumes to vegetables to eggs, oily fish, and of course plant-based meat alternatives. And I'll just note that in some of the reduction scenarios, and the ones in particular that I'll be presenting today, we really focused on achieving reductions in the population average intake by focusing just on red meat and just on high consumers of red meat. And in these scenarios, children and young people who are consuming very little red meat, they didn't have any change to their intake. So we were really just focusing on high consumers in these results. In terms of our data source, as Alana mentioned, this is coming from the DISH survey, which is a representative survey of children and young people living in Scotland, which was conducted last year. DISH assessed dietary intake using up to 4 24-hour dietary recalls, and these were administered over a 2-week period. For children in preschool or primary school, the recalls were completed by the parent with the child's help, if appropriate. And then for children in secondary school, the child had the opportunity to complete the recall themselves, and about 2/3 of them did so. The surveys these dietary recall surveys are reported on an online software program called Intake 24, where you can enter all the foods that you had on the previous day, and then estimate the portion size that you had. And I'll just kind of point that out here. You can estimate the portion size, for example, in this case, for porridge. And then on the back end of Intake 24, each of the foods reported are linked to nutrient information, so we know how many calories, how much fat, how much protein, et cetera, are in, for example, porridge. And then, as I mentioned at the start, we additionally have linked this to a database that has the carbon footprint of each of those food items. So we also know how many greenhouse gas emissions are, how much greenhouse gases are emitted. So I want to point out that the biggest limitation of what I'm going to present today in terms of our results is that we have imperfect data on what children and young people are eating. So they're not perfectly reporting everything in that Intake 24 software. So here I'm just showing a little bit of a schematic of the challenges here. So we know that intake is underreported, and we know this from studies that are done on UK-wide samples where a gold standard method called doubly labeled water suggests that energy intake is underreported compared to true expenditure of energy. And we know that this is especially true for adolescents compared to younger children. But what we don't know from those studies is what is missing from the diet. So is it like in this middle image, is it that the whole diet across the board is underreported or underestimated a little bit? Or is it that we're missing a food entirely? For example, in the top here, a child just forgot that they had a cookie with their lunch, and so they didn't report that. Or in the bottom one, that they had milk with lunch, but they forgot to report that. And the reason this is important is that if we are missing certain things, for example, if we're missing milk in the second example here, that will have important implications for both greenhouse gas emissions associated with diets as well as nutrient intake. And this is really a major knowledge gap that we're hoping to address and improve upon in the future so we can better understand dietary intake. But we know that it's underreported, including in DISH, and the consequence of that is that the results I'm presenting today are a bit conservative. So we are underestimating greenhouse gas emissions, we're underestimating intake of nutrients, and as a result of that underestimation of nutrients, we'll overestimate the number of people at risk of nutrient insufficiency. And because the underreporting is bigger in adolescents, we're going to have, these impacts in terms of underestimation will be bigger in adolescents. So in general, the results we're presenting today are conservative, and really we're erring on the side of caution here. So moving on to our results. So the first aim, looking at consumption of meat and dairy among children and young people in Scotland. We found that almost every child in the survey consumed some type of dairy, and a large majority of children and young people also consumed meat, which you can see in this figure here. In terms of the types of meat and dairy that children are consuming, most of the meat is coming from poultry, which you can see in gray in the pie chart, and then pork, which is in red. There's a very small proportion coming from lamb, and about a fifth coming from beef. With regards to dairy, most of this, more than half, is coming from milk, and that's followed by cheese and yogurt. And these results are quite similar to, in terms of proportion, to what we found in adults in the survey that Alana mentioned we had done in adults previously. In terms of differences across different demographic groups, which I've not presented here because we didn't see huge differences in meat consumption in terms of these proportions across age, sex, or CIMD. The only slight difference by CIMD, and apologies, that's the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, a measure of neighborhood deprivation. The only slight difference we found there was that the proportion from poultry was higher and the proportion from pork was lower among kids living in the most deprived areas compared to those in the least deprived areas. In terms of differences in dairy intake by that metrics, and there were no differences. So moving on to the contribution of meat and dairy to nutrient intake, this figure shows just the percentage of each of the different nutrients which are shown along the bottom here, ranging from vitamins like vitamin B12 to minerals like iodine, calcium, zinc, selenium, and iron. And it's showing the proportion from meat in red and dairy in blue, and then the rest of the diet in the gray. But I've just highlighted here in particular meat and dairy proportions. And what you can see is that dairy in blue is a major source of iodine, vitamin B12, and calcium, as well as a source of zinc and selenium. And then when it comes to meat, meat was an important source of selenium and zinc, and to a slightly lesser extent, vitamin B12 and iron. I thought it was worth just bringing in a couple of data points from the UK-wide National Diet and Nutrition Survey. The latest survey from 2019 to 2023 was published earlier this year. And so whilst in DISH, in the Scottish survey, we did not look at blood or urine biomarkers of nutrient status, only the reported dietary intake, this latest round of the National Diet and Nutrition Survey did look at these in children and young people. And these can give us a bit of a better sense of whether or not intake is sufficient in these populations. And what you can see here are just the results for separated for girls and boys across different age groups reported in the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, and then the proportion who are deficient in the three biomarkers that are relevant to the nutrients that we looked at in this report. And so you can see here that it really highlights in particular for adolescent girls as well as for adolescent boys for iodine that a large proportion of that population or a sizable proportion of that population has nutrient deficiency or biomarkers that are below the cut points that would indicate they had sufficient intake. And I think it's important to point out in particular that some of the nutrients that we may not think of, I think iron is one of the ones that people often think of in the first instance, iron deficiency, anemia, but in fact, iodine in that survey had a much higher percentage than the iron deficiency anemia, including in adolescent girls. And our DISH survey showed that almost half of iodine intake in children and young people in Scotland is coming from dairy products. So this is an interesting result to kind of highlight, and I think it especially highlights the importance of iodine fortification or ensuring that iodine is in plant-based dairy alternatives that may be used as replacements for dairy products. So moving on to looking at red and red processed meat specifically, a Scottish dietary goal currently exists for red and red processed meat, capping it at a max of 70 grams per day for adults. But the dietary goals do not specify a target for children and young people. But we were interested in doing a similar modeling exercise to what Ilana mentioned in terms of trying to understand what maximum intake of red and red processed meat would achieve the reductions that are in line with the Climate Change Committee population average reduction. So if you cap it, for example, if you have a maximum intake of red and red processed meat of 33 grams per day in 2 to 4-year-olds, 39 in 5 to 10-year-olds, and 54 in 11 to 15-year-olds, and you bring everyone who's above those cut points down to the cut point, what kind of overall population reduction in meat consumption do you see? And so what you can see here is that you can achieve the 20% reduction with these levels, and you can achieve the 35% reduction in population average meat with these slightly lower levels. In terms of what proportion of children and young people in Scotland these cut points would impact, so it is currently 36% of children and young people who are currently consuming above these cut points, which would achieve the 20% reduction. And as expected, a much larger proportion, 60%, would be impacted in order to bring consumption down to these cut points. And I'll just note that the cut points for adolescents, so 11 to 15-year-olds that we observed here, are actually quite similar to the cut points that we found in the adult report, the previous report we published last year. So this is the first slide that's looking at simulation scenarios to understand what the impact of meat and dairy reductions has on nutrient intake. It's a very busy slide, so I'll just walk through it kind carefully. So the first thing to point out is that the height of each bar in this represents the percent of children who are below the recommended intake for a given nutrient. And you can see the different nutrients along the bottom here. So the height of this bar is the percent of 2 to 4 year old children who are below the recommended nutrient intake for iron, as one example. Whereas this bar represents the percent below the recommended nutrient intake for 11 to 15 year olds. The blue bars represent current intakes, and then the green bars represent the intakes after high consumers of red and red processed meat bring their consumption down such to achieve a 20% reduction in population average intake. So they're coming down to these levels here. So that's the green bar here. In this figure, there is no replacement. So this is really the worst case scenario if you were to bring consumption of red and red processed meat in high consumers down and they wouldn't replace it with anything. What would be the resultant nutrient intake? So what you can see is that at baseline and after the meat and dairy reduction scenario, a much larger percent of 11 to 15 year olds are below the recommended nutrient intake as compared to younger children. And that's true across all of the nutrients. And it's consistent with a report that we published on overall diets in this population earlier this year, that this particular age group tends to have worse nutrient intake than children, younger children. And what you can see also is that iodine and zinc intake, even in younger children, tends to be more insufficient than things like calcium, iron, and selenium. And then finally, I'll just point out that one of the things, when you look at the difference between the blue and the green, which is the change in the percent of children who will be below recommended intake if they reduce but don't replace the meat and dairy, you can see that the biggest impacts are for that 11 to 15 year old age group as well, and that the impacts are especially large for zinc and iodine. Zinc in particular is both meat and dairy were important sources of zinc, and so that result wasn't particularly surprising that the biggest impacts were for zinc. But what happens if instead of not replacing the meat and dairy, you do replace both of them with various things, with for the dairy, the plant-based dairy alternatives, things like oat milk, and then for meat, a variety of different replacement foods. So this figure is set up the same. So again, the height of the bars is the percent below recommended nutrient intake. I've just focused on 3 of the nutrients here for ease of presentation. I've chosen these because of lower baseline intakes, but also looking at the biomarkers, particularly for iodine, as I mentioned from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. And the blue and green bars are the same as the previous slides. So blue being their current intake, green if we achieve the 20% reduction in population average meat through bringing high consumers down, but no replacement. And then the purple and yellow are the replacement scenarios, or 2 of the many replacement scenarios that were modeled. So the purple one is replacing meat with egg and the dairy with the plant-based dairy alternatives. And the yellow is replacing meat with plant-based meat alternatives and dairy again with plant-based dairy alternatives. And so what you can see here, or what you want to compare across the different bars, is looking at the green bar when you don't replace it. If you replace it with egg or plant-based meat alternatives, and then of course plant-based dairy alternatives, you can see that the nutrient intake comes closer to current intake. So there's some what we would call mitigation or attenuation of the impacts of reducing meat and dairy when they're replaced with these nutrient-dense alternatives. However, what you can see is that particularly when you look at the 11 to 15-year-old age group, that attenuation for things like zinc in this case, or iodine when it's plant-based meat alternatives versus an egg. Eggs are a very rich source of iodine, so even in some of the scenarios, actually replacement with egg was better than current intakes. But you can see that when it's something like a plant-based meat alternative, which may not be fortified with iodine, it doesn't bring it down as much as replacement with egg. So my final figure slide before I start to summarize some of the conclusions from the report is looking at greenhouse gas emissions. So this figure, excuse me, is set up slightly differently. Ooh, excuse me, I had a peanut butter sandwich before this and my throat has a bit more stuck in it. This figure shows absolute greenhouse gas emissions. And the black line here is the excuse me, baseline greenhouse gas emissions associated with diets in children and young people in Scotland. And then each of the bars represents the impact on greenhouse gas emissions across various scenarios. And the longer the bar, the larger the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The little bars that you see at the end in black are uncertainty intervals. And if the uncertainty interval crosses that bold black line at the top, it means that the reduction in emissions was not statistically significant. So for example, you can see here, if you just reduce dairy but not meat, you don't see a statistically significant reduction in emissions. However, across all of the scenarios in which meat was also reduced, you see that the reduction was statistically significant. Excuse me. And then in terms of the different color bars, these are the different meat replacement scenarios. So the purple is no replacement of anything, and then the greens are pulses and legumes or vegetables, blue is eggs, yellow is oily fish, pink is plant-based meat alternatives, and then in these couple scenarios where we just focused on red meat, we looked at replacement with poultry or chicken. And so what the graph shows overall is that greenhouse gas emissions were, as I said, significantly reduced in all of the scenarios when meat was reduced, but not in the dairy-only scenario. And I think what's important to point out is that even when meat was replaced with other foods, when meat and dairy were replaced with other foods, whether that be vegetables or even poultry, there were significant reductions in emissions observed. And I think it's important to point out, again, the baseline intake, so this black bar, is likely underestimated because of underreporting of dietary intake, but the change relative to baseline in these kind of absolute reductions in greenhouse emissions won't be impacted by that. So I think it's better to kind of interpret the changes here rather than the absolute values. So moving on to a couple of conclusion slides. Dairy and meat are widely consumed by most children and young people across Scotland. Dairy in particular was a major source of iodine, and as I mentioned in the National Diet and Nutrition Survey results that were released earlier this year, when you look at biomarkers, this seems to be one of particular concern in this age group, particularly adolescents. And both dairy and meat were major sources of zinc. When meat and dairy were reduced and they weren't replaced with anything, we saw the largest impacts on zinc and iodine, and also the largest impacts in young people versus younger children. When meat was replaced with egg, we saw improved, it can attenuate the impact on iodine intakes, and in some cases it actually can improve intake above and beyond current baseline intakes. And we also found that replacement meat with plant-based meat alternatives can improve and attenuate the impacts on zinc from reducing meat and dairy. We had previously reported that measures are needed to reduce intake of free sugars, saturated fat, and salt, and to increase intake of fiber in this population. This was the initial DISH report where we presented overall dietary intake. And so keeping that in mind, as well as the results of today's presentation, the replacement foods for should meat and dairy reduction occur, replacement foods should focus on a variety of nutrient-rich products that together help meet those recommendations in terms of free sugars, saturated fat, and salt, as well as fiber, but that also improve iodine and zinc intakes. And some of the things that we looked at in this study that, or in this report that met those criteria were things like eggs, oily fish, which I haven't shown today, but is presented in the report, as well as fortified plant-based alternatives, both meat and dairy alternatives, and legumes and vegetables. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we found all scenarios, except when only dairy was reduced, but all scenarios in which meat was reduced achieved significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions compared to baseline, and that was true across the variety of replacement foods, which I had mentioned in the previous bullet point. So, excuse me, that was just a couple of the findings from this report. The report link is available here and will be available through the slides, and I think Sophie probably will put it in the chat as well, I hope. We've also posted a 2-page infographic with key findings on the website, which I've included the link to here. So if you're interested in any of the many scenarios that were modeled in the study that I didn't present today, please do go to the report to check that out. And with that, I think I can't actually see my time, but I hope I've left plenty of time for questions today.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, plenty of time for questions. That was really interesting, and I hope you're feeling okay. There's nothing worse than when we get something stuck in our
Sorry,
throat just when you're presenting, but no. Yeah, so we'll move on to questions now. So if you're able to add your questions into the chat, and we'll start answering them. But I'll kick off with a question because it's quite a big jump for people to move away from meat and dairy. So I don't know if Alana or even Lindsay, how can we best support people to do this? Because it is, if you're used to eating lots of meat and dairy, it's quite difficult, I'd imagine.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. Yeah, definitely. As we noted in our report and in our previous work looking at adults, around 80–90% of people in Scotland are consuming meat and dairy, so it can seem like a very big step away from the norm to reduce our intakes of these foods even just a little. We ideally want to see overall improvements to diets, so not just looking at reductions in meat. We want to see increased fruit and veg, fibre, oily fish, reduced fat, salt and sugar, and that will benefit both our health and also the health of the planet. So we definitely encourage people to take a look at our Eat Well Your Way resource, which is available on our website to support families in making small but manageable changes to bring diets closer to our recommendations. But we also need to be mindful that changes to our wider food environment are also needed so that healthy and sustainable choices are also the easy choices. Thanks.
And I might just add that I wasn't really explicit about this, but the changes we're not at all talking about elimination of meat or dairy. These are small reductions, as Alana said, which I think are maybe possibly more approachable for people. So it's just cutting back a little bit in terms of portion size. So some other work that was done by a PhD student here at University of Edinburgh looked at how people are kind of naturally reducing red meat consumption over time. And what we're finding is that that kind of natural behavior change that's happening over time is just slightly smaller portions of meat rather than completely eliminating it. So if you're making a bolognese sauce, just putting a little bit less meat in and maybe putting some, tinned lentils or something in as well, you can see this reduction through that type of behavior. So it's not getting rid of the meat in the bolognese sauce, but just reducing it a little bit.
Yeah, smaller changes definitely make things easier. So we've had a few questions come in. So this will probably be for you, Lindsay. When you replaced meat with egg, did you replace gram for gram or with a typical portion of egg?
Yeah,
if gram for gram is realistic.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it is a gram for gram replacement. It's not a typical portion of an egg. So I really do think it's a fair point about whether or not that's a exactly realistic swap, as you pointed out, Gillian. So thanks very much for that comment. These are, small changes, and it's kind of a first pass at these simulations. So I think we are interested in potentially looking at more, more targeted substitution behaviors. But for now, it's quite micronutrient focused. So it was a gram for gram replacement. Yeah.
Thank you. What about increasing white fish as another source of protein or micronutrients?
Yeah, that one might be for you as well, Lindsay. It's not something that we've looked at in this round, but I think it would be, a reasonable substitute for people moving away from meat to consider white fish as well as oily fish. Oily fish particular because we've got the recommendations there in our dietary goal. But yeah, really good point.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think it's just a bit of caution about how the oily fish is, or the white fish is consumed. We would want to be taking a careful look at that, to ensure it doesn't worsen diets if it's fried and, yeah.
Angela has asked, and this will be for you, Lindsay, are the reduction targets concurrent or consecutive? So 20%, the other 35%.
Oh, right. Sorry about that. Yeah, so it's 20% is the target right now, and then in the future it will be 35%. So it's just adding an additional 15% on top of the 20%. Yeah.
Sense. Were there any cost analysis carried out? Shopping behaviours can be influenced by household budget. So is there any impact on cost with the replacements of dairy and meat?
So we didn't do that for this dish paper, but we did do it for the adult paper. And I don't know if Joe is in the room anywhere, but we can include a link to preprint in Nature food in the chat.
I am here.
Searching through the list. Oh, Joe.
Yeah.
Great. Joe, do you, if you could stick it in the chat, Joe, but if you have any comments, Joe, as well. Joe is the person who did all of the simulation modeling, so.
Yeah, I'll find that and put it in the chat.
Terrific. Thanks, Joe. But in general, we didn't see significant increases in the cost of diets with the substitutions that we've modeled. And I think one of the reasons for this is that we are talking about pretty small changes in the diet. And as Gillian pointed out with the egg example, we are not doing, it's a gram for gram replacement. So if we are reducing meat by 20% and say that would be 10 grams, you're only adding 10 grams worth of egg back in. And so it's the cost of 10 grams of egg rather than a full egg. So it's not a perfect analysis in that way. But in a gram for gram cost analysis, there wasn't a significant change. Again, I think it's because these are relatively small changes.
Thank you. Could you explain in more detail whether any of your replacements were already fortified and whether your assessment is that dairy replacement fortification can address most micronutrient concerns?
Yep, so the replacement plant-based meats and dairy alternatives were fortified. We use the Nutrient Data Bank, which is the same data bank that's used for the UK-wide survey. I mentioned the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. The replacements were based on existing frequency of intake in the population. So most of the plant-based milk, for example, in Scottish children and young people is oat milk. And so most of the substituted milk in the simulation scenarios was coming from oat milk. And we just use the oat milk nutrient values that were in the nutrient data bank. We know, of course, that there's actually quite a bit of variability in what different oat milks fortify with. Some do include iodine, some don't. Most include calcium. And so that variability is not captured in the simulations. It's just that one value from the nutrient data bank for oat milk. We didn't look at kind of the distribution of things available on the market in Scotland. So it's certainly a limitation of the analysis. And I do think when choosing these plant-based products, because there is so much variability, you do as a consumer have to be a bit cognizant and look for what it's fortified with, and is there any fortification beyond just calcium, particularly for things like iodine and zinc.
Mm-hmm.
Alana, I'm not sure if you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, just to kind of signpost the recent SACN COT benefit risk assessment on the plant-based milk drinks and comparisons with cow's milk, which included that recommendation for fortification of these drinks, which is really important when considering suggesting that people swap to these drinks. So yeah, just to signpost that. Thanks.
I've got loads of really good questions coming in. Another one, did you find any consumer resistance barriers to switching to legumes and vegetables, for instance, shopping, cooking, or preparing?
So that wasn't considered as part of this research, but it's something that we're very alive to. We know from our other surveys of consumer attitudes and other evidence that it is a big barrier just to change anything in diet, whether it's reducing sugary drinks or confectionery, those kind of things, but also moving towards plant-based options. And particularly cost comes up as a barrier, tastes and preferences. So yeah, there are a lot of barriers, but we hope that through things like our Eat Well Your Way resource, which focuses on, rather than changing everything all at once, it's changing one thing at a time and kind of getting that behaviour change embedded before moving on to the next. So yeah, really great point.
Yeah, thank you. Did we look at the differences between processed and unprocessed meat intakes? Why was it just focused on red meat reduction and not total meat, given the high consumption of chicken?
Yep. We did look at those and they're in the report, but not sure, Alana. I mean, the focus on red meat is because there's an existing Scottish dietary goal on red and red processed meat, which is based on a 2010 SACN Iron and Health. SACN is the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition report on iron and health, which also looked at other outcomes like colorectal cancer. So we focused in on red meat for that reason, but we did do some substitution modeling with chicken, as I mentioned, for the ones focused on red meat. There's a lot to be done on defining processed poultry. And right now, processed poultry, based on how it's currently defined in the nutrient data bank I mentioned, there's very little processed poultry intake, but that is probably a difference in definition. These definitions of what is processed have evolved a little bit over time. So we're currently looking at this, but it's very early days. So Alana, do you want to add something to that maybe?
Yeah, just to say, absolutely, that focus on red and red processed meat was in line with our Scottish dietary goals. So the evidence relating to poor health outcomes with high intakes there. But I think it's worth noting that there are lots and lots of different scenarios that could be done to to meet these ambitions. And so there could be other scenarios there looking at just processed white meat and processed meat alone. So yeah, it's these are just, I don't want to say just a handful, because actually there were rather quite a lot, but yeah, there are certainly more we could add to that list. And also just to flag, we know that the evidence base has evolved over the years in relation to red meat versus processed meat. And so that is why we have actually just recently commissioned Lindsay and her team to look at this for us, to understand what health impacts there may be that are different for the different types of meat. So yeah, we'll be reporting on that in due course next year as well. Perhaps another webinar. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And then that question also had a second part, which I'll just ask quickly. Did you consider bioavailability of iron?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an excellent question, and unfortunately, we haven't considered that in any of our modeling. And so it is the limitation that not only iron but also zinc, we have not considered bioavailability, and we also haven't considered related to that how they're consumed, other things within the context of that meal that are consumed along with these foods. So there's definitely we recognize that micronutrients aren't consumed in isolation, but it is currently beyond simulation modeling that we're aware of that takes into account those things. So definitely an interest for the future.
Okay. When gathering data on intakes, did you identify foods as specific recipes or brands, or was it just more generic categories?
Yeah, so, well, thanks very much, Angela, for that question. For things like porridge, we definitely gathered information about if it was prepared with salt, with milk, with water, that sort of thing. But in terms of the brands, there are brands for some products, but not for most of them. We're doing an interesting study right now that is actually collecting brand level information, and we'll be able to see how much having that information and the nutrient data specific to it. So if you're getting a burger from McDonald's versus Burger King, or different independents, how different does the nutrient composition in the whole diet look? But we're in the very early days of that, so I don't have any information on that now. But right now, it's kind of an average cheese pizza or an average pepperoni pizza.
Mari has asked, what happens when you cannot use eggs as a replacement? For instance, if you have allergies, is there another food type that can kind of give you the same nutrients?
Good question. So yeah, obviously we'd modelled a range of different scenarios, so not just egg, and that really highlights just how important it is to have that variety. The modelling obviously just looked at when you reduce the meat and the dairy and replacing those lost foods. But what we want to see is people move towards the Eat Well guide overall, so that you're not having to rely on an egg. It's on a variety of foods. So yeah, I think the answer to that would be to look at the Eat Well guide advice more generally. Thank you.
How is the CO2 calculated on production on farm or something else?
Yep. So the CO2 is calculated from all the way from production on the farm to the retailer. We don't have home preparation if it was cooked, in a microwave versus in an oven or something like that. So just up to the retailer. And so it does include, we know most emissions are kind of on the production side of things. And so that's why we do tend to see, bigger impacts for the animal source foods as compared to the plant-based foods in the analysis. But yeah, we can share, and the link actually that Joe shared just below this comment, that link includes really detailed information about the database that has the emissions factors in it. And it also includes a link to that paper that has the actual values in case you want to see the value for any of the food groups that were reported.
Yeah, I can add that in as well when I send around the webinar recording, so that everyone has that. So do we know the iodine content of dairy alternatives compared to cow's milk?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I see that Alana has included the SACN report in the chat. So that will be the best source to grab that information from.
Okay, thank you. Are we able to share an example of the baseline diet and the modelled replacement diet, e.g. a week's intake, and what this would look like?
I can start that if you want.
Yeah, that would be great, Alana, please.
Yeah, so we don't have an example baseline at this time in terms of what the current diet looks like over the course of the week. It would be very, very interesting to see that. However, what we do have already are 2 examples of week-long menus that meet our dietary recommendations. So I can find the link. Those are called Eat Well Every Day. There's lots of Eat Wells in the world of nutrition, and that shows 7 days of intake, breakfast, lunch, dinners and snacks, as well as drinks, and that meets all of our dietary recommendations. We have done some preliminary analysis of those menus to understand what the greenhouse gas emissions impact of those are, and we found that, yeah, again, in line with all the other evidence, that this would be a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from our baseline diet, and that's based on research from Lindsay's team again. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Matthew's asked, did you consider the bioavailability of the key micronutrients when replacing with plant-based alternatives? If not, could this mean overestimation of the mitigations? Lindsay, so you're on mute. There we go. Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, as I've mentioned, we don't have any bioavailability in the simulation modeling at this point in time. So that's not accounted for here. And so absolutely for the plant-based ones, that would be the case. But less so for, the things like eggs and oily fish and chicken that we also modeled in many of the scenarios. So.
Thank you. So Tess is asking, we're seeing a lot of pushback from schools, e.g. in Wales, around strategies to moderate meat consumption in particular and providing healthy alternatives on menus. Are we seeing the same in Scotland? And how can we avoid this increasingly becoming a culture war and missing opportunities to improve children's diets? It's a good question.
It's a really good question. Yeah. I'm not sure I have a complete answer to that, but I mean, I'm certainly aware of things within the media around meat-free Mondays and veganuary in school, and it can be quite controversial. I mean, I think the thing I always come back to is that often in the discussion around reducing meat, it's translated as everyone has to follow a vegan or vegetarian diet, and that's not the case. It's more around reducing this excess consumption and the high consumption rather than completely removing it. So I think there maybe is a bit more to do around the conversation there to make it less controversial, because it doesn't feel that controversial to meet our goal, which has been in place for a long, long time. So yeah, I think it's a really good question and point for discussion. Thanks so much, Tess.
Thank you. Are you using global average data for emissions?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we are using, in most instances, global average data. The reason for that is that there isn't very much life cycle assessment data that's specific to, certainly specific to Scotland or UK-wide commodity data. So where it is available, the database does, where it is available, and we're confident that most of that food group is consumed from own production. In the UK, it is used, but the reality is also that we import a huge amount of our food that's consumed in the UK, and so sometimes defaulting to the global average is more representative of where our food supply is coming from. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, maybe just answer these last two questions, and then I think that will be time. Could we give a sense of the health impacts, e.g. you touched on cancer, of reducing red and processed meat for children?
Yeah, I'll just say that we've not modeled that. So we did do that in adults, but the risk prediction equations used in the simulation are developed for adult populations. One of the co-investigators, Geraldine McNeil, who I think might be here, but she's her and Alexa Bellows, to give one example, are working on early diets in children and how that develops into future chronic disease risk. That project is I think just in the first year, so we'll have to wait for those findings. But we're definitely interested in doing that. But there are a lot of unknowns about how, you know, really early diets when you're 2 to 10 years old, how that translates into future risk. So unfortunately, hasn't been included here, but hopefully we'll be able to build off some of that work that Geraldine and Alexa are doing for the future.
Thank you. And then finally from Kate, what was the average red meat consumption? Was it below the current 70 grams a day recommendation, or what was considered a high intake?
Yep. So the 70-gram recommendation is for adults, so the goals don't currently have a target for children. And average intake was below that cut point, but you might expect that anyway, because the gram intake of food is lower in children and young people. We considered high intake that was above the cut point that would help us achieve that 20% reduction in the Climate Change Committee target. So it varied by age group, but there's a wee table in the slides that has the high intake cut point that you can check out if you want to know exactly what it was for each of the age groups.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Lindsay and Alana. I think we'll stop there, and we've got through pretty much most of the questions. So yeah, thank you very much. This has been recorded, and I'll be uploading it to YouTube and then sharing the video for yourselves to watch back, or anyone that has missed today. And we'll also share the reports. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lana.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.